Welcome to Alpha Centurion. I'll be your guide. Today we're going to be reading the Bible with the Church Fathers. Specifically, we're going to be looking at John Chrysostom versus Origen on Genesis 1 through 3. Another way to look at this is going to be the Antiochian versus Alexandrian schools of theology. That is, the literal perspective of the Bible versus the allegorical perspective. Background. Let's look at first John Chrysostom. Chrysostom lived between 314 and 407 AD, and among many other works, he wrote about 76 homilies on Genesis. The collection that I'm looking at, I believe, has listed 65. He was a preacher in Antioch and in Constantinople. He stands high in the tradition of the Antioch school, looking for a more literal, by the letter interpretation of the Bible. His is an exegetical tradition. He preaches and promotes good works, such as attending church, Bible study, and giving alms, and the avoidance of evil deeds, such as gambling, being lazy, sloth, and watching horse races. The only time he allows for a spiritual or allegorical sense of the interpretation is when that interpretation is in support of or supported by the New Testament, especially the writings of Paul. Now let's look at Origen. Origen was born around 185 AD, most likely in or around Alexandria, though that is disputed by his detractors. His father was a known martyr. Origen himself is a bright light and immense structure of the early church, as his works and accomplishments are myriad. He is considered by many to be the first Christian theologian and the first to use reason as a methodology for examining the Bible and the biblical text. At least the first Christian to do so. He was a dean and a major figure of the Alexandrian school, which was founded by Saint Mark the Evangelist. That's right, the apostle and the author of the Gospel of Mark. The school didn't find fame until about 190, and Origen didn't become dean of the school until about 203 AD. Origen examined the Bible from a spiritual, or what we might now call an allegorical point of view. His most famous work is titled On First Principles. He is spoken highly of by other major Christian figures such as Eusebius. But for all of his accomplishments and his many admirers in the early church, he has had vocal and powerful detractors, such as Demetrius, the bishop of Alexandria, whose slander against Origen persists to this very day in many prominent Protestant and Calvinist circles. Origen was a well-read classicalist for his time, and he enjoyed studying the Bible, first in the Greek and then later in the Hebrew. And it is his fondness for the Hebrew which will begin to get him in trouble with the Orthodox of his day. That's Orthodox small o. Around 215, Origen visited Rome, a see that still appreciates his gifts to Christian theology. He was well traveled for the time, and even toured through Palestine. His death is disputed. He either died in ignominy in 255, having unfortunately survived horrible torture, or he died as a martyr sometime between 250 and 255 during the persecution of Decius. If you think Origen should be considered a church father, then you are more likely to think that he was martyred and thus went to heaven. If, on the other hand, you think that he was a heretic, you are more likely to think that he died having been denied martyrdom. First, let's look at St. John Chrysostom's literal interpretation of Genesis 1 through 3. He begins by an exhortation to temperance, obedience, and moderation, which will lead to wellness, while he warns that indulgence, intemperance, and mildness lead to illness and death. For Chrysostom, if overindulgence is the cause of the problem, then fasting and avoidance is the cure and corrective. He is a proponent of self-denial. He then warns that one should not compete in fasting or temperance, nor even in moderation. One must not go to excess or excesses in being temperate. One must demonstrate self-control, even in self-denial. He then looks at Romans 2:13 and quotes that it is not the hearers of the law whom are just before God, but it is the doers of the law who shall be justified. Then Chrysostom adds a quote from Amos 6:3. You who put far away in your mind the day of coming disaster, woe to you that sleep upon beds of ivory and are wanton on your couches, that eat the lambs out of their flock, and the calves out of the midst of their herd. You who sing songs idly from the psalter, you that think themselves to have instruments for music like David, you who drink wine in bowls, and anoint themselves with the best of ointments, but yet are not concerned for the affliction of Joseph. Wherefore now shall they go? For you will be the first to be held captive, led at the head of the exiles, of those who go into captivity, and that faction, the revelers, the luxurious ones, shall be taken away. After this grim warning, Chrysostom affirms biblical inspiration, that the Word of God truly spoke through the inspired authors, though it was written many generations after the events portrayed or relayed had occurred. Chrysostom takes pains to downplay the abilities of human reasoning, and then takes a moment to talk down to Jewish people for being stubborn in their doubt and questioning, reminding the Jewish of his audience, as relates to the Hebrew Bible, that it is God who makes and transforms all things and refashions all things according to his will. He bases his teachings about spiritual things on visible realities, that while we are to be guided by the Spirit in our teaching and sharing the good news, we are to do so by faith within our limitations and not try to grasp higher than our reach. He advises that we should, and explains that he does, adapt the message of the good news to different audiences, based on their needs and their comprehension abilities. That your methods, means, and wording of the message must be adapted to who you are speaking in front of or writing to. This for him is especially true when dealing with the Old Testament, and even more so when working through Genesis. Chrysostom, in example, speaks of two passages here. He compares Genesis 1, 1 through 5 with John 1, 1 through 5. But he also makes many inferences and implications that he does not expound on, nor explain in any detail for the rest of these sets of homilies that I read. For instance, what is meant by authorship, or what he means by the separation of light and darkness. These are just two examples of where Chrysostom's principles of interpretation can be applied aptly, but he merely teases out the inference and doesn't delve into deeper meaning. This is a limitation of his Antiochian approach. For instance, on authorship, he implies much. He implies that even given the objections to Moses being the literal author, Chrysostom claims that it is still correct, given those objections you can get to from reason, to call Moses the blessed, or that is, the inspired author of Genesis. His explanation runs something like this, and I'm going to put it into semi-modern terms. It is right to call Moses the author of Genesis, just as it is right to call Mark Twain the author of Tom Sawyer, or Shakespeare the author of the plays attributed to him, or Homer the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The next reasoned to objection he also dismisses. That even if a myriad of authors penned the work, even if great authors wrote a series of works together, but they did so under one pen name, it would still be correct to give credit of authorship to that pen name. As we know what we are getting and what to expect when we pick up that pen name, we, the audience, know and trust that pen name and understand the style and conventions we are to expect if we read something by, say, Anne Rice or by Anne Roquelaire, to put a finer point on it. We, the consuming audience, are not reading Samuel Clemens. We are reading Mark Twain, and we know the difference. So too with Moses. Moses is the tongue. Moses is the pen. Moses is the instrument God uses through inspiration to tell his story. In the story of Genesis, Moses is the storyteller. That is his role for us, the listener and the reader. Does that mean that Moses was the first to tell the story? Or that he was its only contributor? No more than Homer was to the Iliad. But when we read the Iliad, we read and hear Homer. When we read Moses, we know whom and when he represents. That attribution may have come later than the first recitation of the story, but that does not change the authorship of the story for us, nor does it alter the inspiration. In this case, the Holy Spirit inspired blessed Moses, whomever blessed Moses happened to be. First four homilies of St. John Chrysostom's Apology on Genesis can be broken up into 7 points and span the first 4 days of creation. The 7 themes are as follows. Day 1, God is the creator of all things. God is a God of order. Day 2, God is a God of authority and obedience. God is a God of goodness. Day 3, God is a God of unity. God is a God of beauty. Day 4, all things have their use and purpose. Lights are there to guide and divide. Vegetation, growth, and fruits, even those things that are harmful, inedible, or poisonous, are there and are that way for a reason. Chrysostom then comes to some conclusions about the message of the story so far. For him, the first 2 accounts in Genesis are teaching that there is one heaven, one earth, one reality. And thus there is only one God and only one truth. But again, he doesn't expound beyond his own limitations of interpretation, nor does he go beyond the perceived limitation of the text into speculation. Instead, he takes this opportunity in raising and then dismissing the obvious questions and objections to promote daily Bible study and daily prayer as an exercise for the mind and soul. That rigor and discipline in good habits and good works will produce good fruit. Chrysostom also takes time to demonstrate in his writing an appreciation for St. Paul, something many of his readers and commentators take note of. To make sense of his homilies on Genesis, it is important to make a mental note that he is preaching to a domestic church during the season of Lent, that he is actively encouraging them to participate in small group daily Bible study, and that in these small groups they ought to converse on the divine and on biblical topics. That is, instead of gossiping, gambling, gaming, or indulging in other temptations. He then finally gets to the body of the text. But first he compliments the precision and considerateness of the blessed author, as he says that he teaches through the telling of the creation of Adam that the body comes first and then ensoulment. But at this point, we come to Homily 15, and we get to the first major textual corruption of this collection. So the rest of this homily is a paraphrase of what is missing from his lecture. Who inserted that paraphrase? I do not know. Ironically, his next encouragement is to say that with the Christian, correct doctrine is of no benefit unless one attends to the business of living. Therefore, blessed is the one who both does and teaches. He then quotes Matthew 5:19, followed by an exhortation to let us not stop short at the literal level. Instead, let us reason from the perceivable, visible realities to the superiority of spiritual realities. Here again, Chrysostom complements the precision and considerateness of the text and author. He explains again that the biblical text, especially Genesis, is written with the limitations of its audience in mind. He explains that the words used by the text are precise, that to will, direct, and command are each different things, just as to form and shape are different modes of operation, as is the word formed versus fashioned, each saying something different about how God approaches the creation of different creatures and beings. Then, after plenty of base level commentary, which can be found in most study Bibles or most apologetic YouTube channels that speak about Genesis, the next big topic Chrysostom takes on in his homilies is the fall. And here he says something I had not heard elsewhere before. He claims that the snake in the garden was not the devil, but that the snake was used by the devil, and that this is evidenced by the devil's words and the fact that snakes don't talk, that the devil worked through the serpent. But by being a tool for the devil, the serpent was still punished, and that we, mortal humans, shall trample upon the serpents and scorpions of our mind. Considering that I had just read a little over 100 pages extolling the benefits of a literal interpretation, I was almost shocked that Chrysostom went for a more spiritual, metaphysical interpretation here, that the snakes and scorpions mentioned in Genesis are the temptations and doubts that live in our mind. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil also gets an allegorical treatment here, though to a much lesser degree. The forbidden tree is that of carnal knowledge. It is the divide between the theoretical knowledge of evil and the act of evil. It is highlighting the difference between and is the embodiment of theoretical knowledge and practical experience, between potential and actual. The eating of the fruit is knowing the difference by experiencing it. The act of knowing versus simply understanding. Going back to Chrysostom's warning about the limitations of human reason. Knowing is different than doing. Doing is a deeper level of knowing. It is knowing in a true sense. In this vein, Chrysostom continues. The concept that God strode in the evening is equivalent to the conscience, which knows all, but still asks, especially when we lay down at night. Adam, trying to hide from God is equivalent to shame. To be denuded and aware of one's own nakedness is equivalent to being stripped of God's good glory. The reason for this departure from a literal, simple reading of the plain text is that Genesis, if read absolutely literal, pushes against the understanding of God from Psalms and the New Testament. An anthropomorphic God is not compatible with the simplistic, meaning unchanging, all-knowing, all-powerful, timeless, eternal, monotheistic, Trinitarian God of the Gospels, Acts, Epistles, and Revelation. Hence the limitations of the Antiochian school, Protestantism, ultraliteralism, and sola scriptura. Now, for contrast, let us look at Origen and how he understands Genesis 1, verses 1 through 29. For Origen, the heaven being spoken of in Genesis 1 is incorporeal, which is consistent with later biblical text, which states that God's throne comes before the world. Therefore, Genesis and the verse in the beginning is not and cannot be speaking of temporal beginning, nor is Genesis meant to be taken in a chronological manner or temporal sense. Like Chrysostom, Origen finds many of the same themes in the opening 7 lines of the Bible for both men, and therefore for both schools. Genesis and the Bible as a whole teaches that God creates, God orders, God brings light from and to darkness. God brings order from and to chaos. For Origen, though, the abyss referenced in Genesis is the same as the abode of the devil and the demons. For Origen, he sees direct references to the dragon and his angels in the warnings and ongoings of Genesis. In Origen's recounting of the Genesis account, God dissolved the darkness, and it was God who names all things before the invention of language. This can be and is true because all this takes place before the existence of time. And time, for Origen, is older than this world. You may, at this point, be excused for thinking mistakenly that this Alexandrian method of interpretation is more literal and fundamental than the Antiochian. But you would be wrong on at least one of those counts. For then, Origen explains that the firmament here and the heaven made in the second account is corporeal. For him, the division is between earth and heaven, between body and soul. The heaven of the mind and the earth of the body. Darkness is chaos, which is to say lack of reason, lack of consciousness, lack of self-awareness. Light is order, reason, thought, and consciousness. Genesis 1 through 8 is the story of humanity reaching consciousness, both collective and individual. Origen's next big claim is that the world created in Genesis came into being before time existed. For all the fun this concept and idea can generate, it does lead to some questions. For instance, what does this represent? What is the water above heaven? What are the waters below heaven? Is darkness equivalent to the abyss? Is the abyss equivalent to hell? Origen implies that heaven and spirit is equivalent to mind. that mind is equivalent to self, that heaven is the internal, eternal self, and that earth is the external, temporal self. The firmament is the barrier between your existential, metaphysical self and your practical physical body. Christ and the church are the sun and the moon for the believing Christian. He goes on that just as a blind man cannot see or make sense of the light radiating from the sun, so the spiritually blind cannot make sense or understand the light radiating from Christ. The birds are equivalent to high thoughts, while crawling things are equivalent to low thoughts. The firmament divides the spiritual from the carnal. Origen's theory, his interpretation of Genesis, is that it is speaking of the spiritual creation, and that Genesis 2:5 is speaking of carnal creation. Origen is an interesting and intriguing read. While his approach does circumvent the current literal development hypothesis, Origen does have a proof that in Genesis 1, man is formed, while in Genesis 2, man is shaped from slime. Genesis 1 being the form or spirit of all things, man being the likeness of God, bears special significance for Origen. Earth, sun, and moon are created by God. Everything else is created by God's command. There is present in his interpretation some fine distinctions between words, but I cannot deny that his approach is compelling. Origen's view on humanity is also different than Chrysostom's. For Origen, male and female are stewards of the earth, the animals, and the vegetation. They, male and female, are equal in dignity. Yes, the male first, then the female second in authority, but that authority is over all creation. This order shows sovereignty of God over beast, earth, rock, and human alike. Ocean or fish, air or bird, God has sovereignty over all. In Origen's take on the events of the fall, animals suffer due to our fault, due to our flaw. The whole of creation suffers. Our power, then, is in the care and the welfare of the planet, its resources, and its life that lives on it, including each other and ourselves. As the text says, we are like gods, but we are like God's lowercase g in our dominion over the earth and its creatures. We are made in both the image and in the likeness of God. Form and dominion, spirit and creation. Through reason, we as humans can dominate even lions and sharks. The text shows this dominion in our naming things. It should be noted that in these older early church father homilies, you will find that the woman is usually named Zoe and not Eve, as we are accustomed to. So, in keeping with that tradition, I'll be using the name Zoe instead of the name Eve for the rest of this video. A common misunderstanding about Zoe and the serpent, as some might explain it, was that Zoe was the weak-willed one, the cause of our fall. But for Origen and the Alexandrian school, this could not be further from the truth. She is as much human as Adam. Zoe is as much human and free as you or I. Evidence for this is in the text of Genesis itself. For the woman has a conversation with the snake. The woman stands her ground against the snake, accuses it of its own faults without hesitation. In Origen's telling of it, she could have chosen not to take its advice. The snake was scared of her. She was not scared of it. Again, he highlights that she conversed comfortably with it. She did not take flight. She was not terrified by its appearance. Here we get Origen's understanding of sin. For him, and presumably for his school, sin is the loss of both esteem and authority together. That we should not be shocked by this, nor should we be resentful for the punishment, nor think it unjust, as we are fellow slaves of God, just as are the animals. Animals and beasts, crops and wild jungles, and untamed forest all serve and aid us in our daily lives, even though they suffer for our mistakes and our cruelty. And we serve God. Here, Origen reminds us of the biblical precept that not sacrifice of animals, but contrite spirit and a contrite heart is what God desires. For Origen, the co-creation accounts are a summary of what we would call evolution. But for him, it documents more than just physical development, but it documents spiritual adaptation and mutation as well. Life adapts to its environment, and the environment adapts to the life that is living on it. Habitation is more than just mere survival. The land, seas, rivers, and waters all change and adapt. Life in temporal, corporal reality changes. But in the spiritual realm, there is no change, only the eternal. Here, Origen iterates the same philosophical warning as Chrysostom. Everything in moderation. The goal here seems to be excellence of some sort. Human or divine is unclear at this point of his homily. For Origen, excellence is equivalent to perfection, and perfection is equivalent to the good. If all created things are constantly changing, then excellence must be reached in the spiritual realm. Life is affected by all that is around and interacting with it. Gravity, wind, pressure, and time to heal and grow are all necessary. But do not fear, for all is guided and or is permitted by God's will. For Origen, it is our ability to acclimatize and actualize that is the evidence of design. And then he gets very near to Chrysostom and says that this precision and considerateness is proof of God's goodwill toward us. I would like to add a note here that you may be tempted to contrast and criticize Chrysostom's apparent anti-Semitism and misogyny against Origen's perceived environmentalism and egalitarianism. But this would be an anachronistic mistake, as these political and social concepts did not exist during the periods that these men were writing. The same accusation and contrast is made by many modern would-be theologians when it comes to St. Peter and St. Paul. This perceived difference and tension is anachronistic to the lives, thinking, and times of these men. Hope you enjoyed this one. I know this is a slightly longer video, but I wanted to make it in as one. Let me go ahead and give you some sources. St. Chrysostom's The Church Fathers, Volume 74, St. John Chrysostom's Homilies on Genesis 1 through 17, translated by Robert C. Hill, published by the Catholic University of America Press, 1986 and 1999. The other source that I used was Origen, The Fathers of the Church, Volume 71, Origen Homilies on Genesis and Exodus, translated by Ronald E. Henney, published by the Catholic University of America Press, 1982. 2002, pages 1 through 71. Again, those were my references. If you want to go check them out, that's where you can check them out and see if what I'm saying is accurate. Peace, like, and subscribe. Talk to y'all later. Have a good night.